Have you ever felt like your identity was stripped away? Like everything you'd worked for, everything you'd built your life around, just vanished. That's how I felt on my first Monday morning after 42 years in ministry. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. out of habit, made my coffee, sat down at my desk, and then it hit me I had nowhere to go. No sermon to write. No congregation waiting. Just emptiness. The silence in my house was deafening. My name is Jack Peterson, and after 4 decades as a pastor, retirement felt less like a reward and more like exile. But what I didn't realize that morning was that my greatest ministry was about to begin. For as long as I could remember, I was Pastor Jack, not just on Sundays, but everywhere I went. At the grocery store, at my kids' school events, even on vacation. My calling defined me. It wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. When people asked, "What do you do?" I never hesitated. I'm a pastor, simple, clear, purpose-driven. But then retirement came, and suddenly that question became terrifying. What do I do now? Who am I now? I remember sitting across from my wife, Martha, about 3 months into retirement. She looked at me over dinner and said something I'll never forget. "Jack, I married a man, not a profession. I'm still here. But I'm not sure you are." That hit me hard. She was right. I was physically present, but mentally and spiritually, I was lost. I'd spend hours watching the news, scrolling through social media, or just staring out the window. My sense of purpose had evaporated, and with it went my joy, my energy, and even parts of my faith. I think that's something many of us face when we retire, regardless of profession. But for those in ministry or any calling-centered career, it can feel like a double loss. You lose your daily work and a core piece of your identity. You know what's ironic? I spent decades counseling people through spiritual dry spells. I'd sit in my office and listen as church members described feeling distant from God, uncertain of their purpose. I had all the right biblical references, all the perfect pastoral advice. God hasn't moved, I tell them. He's right where he's always been. Sometimes we just need new eyes to see him. Beautiful words. Helpful words, even. But when I found myself in that same desert, those words felt hollow. My prayer life, once rich and consistent, became mechanical. Bible verses I'd memorized decades ago felt like someone else's language. Sunday mornings became painful. Sitting in the congregation instead of the pulpit made me feel like an outsider in my own spiritual home. One Sunday, I couldn't take it anymore. I skipped church. The first time in over 40 years. I told Martha I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie. My soul was sick. Instead of worship, I drove to a state park and hiked alone. And there, surrounded by God's creation rather than the church building I'd served in for so long, I finally broke down. "God," I prayed, and my voice actually cracked. "I don't know who I am anymore. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid you're finished with me." The silence that followed was profound. No thunderous response. No dramatic sign. Just the wind in the trees and the distant call of birds. But something shifted in that moment of raw honesty. I'd admitted what I'd been afraid to acknowledge, that I feared my usefulness to God had an expiration date. And that fear had been paralyzing me. 6 months into retirement, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Thomas, a young man I'd mentored years ago who was now pastoring a small church in a neighboring town. "Pastor Jack," he said, sounding exhausted. "I hate to bother you in your retirement, but I'm drowning here. The church is growing, which is great, but I'm the only staff member. I'm writing sermons, visiting hospitals, managing the building issues, trying to train leaders. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." I felt a familiar stirring, that pastoral instinct to help, to serve. But I also felt something else, relevance. Someone needed the very experience and wisdom I'd spent decades accumulating. "Let's meet for coffee," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of anticipation. That coffee meeting turned into a weekly mentoring session. I found myself energized, engaged. The knowledge I'd gained through 4 decades of ministry wasn't obsolete. It was needed now more than ever. One day, Thomas looked at me across the table and said, "You seem more alive now than when you were running a church of 500 people." He was right. And that's when it hit me. I had confused position with purpose. My calling had never been to a job title. My calling was to serve, to teach, to walk alongside others in their spiritual journey. And that calling didn't require an office or a pulpit. This realization led me to a period of intentional reflection. If my purpose wasn't tied to my professional role, then what exactly was it? I started journaling again, something I hadn't done consistently since seminary. I asked myself hard questions. What unique gifts and experiences do I bring to the table at this stage of life? Who might benefit from what I've learned, both from my successes and my failures? What gives me energy and joy when I do it? What needs do I see around me that I feel drawn to address? The answers didn't come all at once. But slowly, a clearer picture emerged. My purpose hadn't changed as much as it had evolved. I still had a pastor's heart, but now I had a retired pastor's perspective, and that was uniquely valuable. I realized that after decades of being in the spotlight, preaching weekly, leading meetings, being the visible face of a congregation, I now had the freedom to serve in ways that were less visible but potentially more impactful. One afternoon, I was flipping through an old journal from my early days in ministry. I found an entry from when I was 28 years old, full of passion but short on experience. I'd written, "Sometimes I feel like I'm building the plane while flying it. I wish I had someone who's been where I'm going to show me the way." That entry was like a lightning bolt. I had become the very person my younger self had longed for, someone with experience, perspective, and the scars that come with decades of ministry. And there were countless young pastors out there right now, building their planes while flying them, wishing for exactly what I could offer. With this newfound clarity, I began to intentionally reshape my retirement around a new kind of ministry, one focused on supporting and mentoring church leaders. It started small, with just Thomas and 2 other young pastors from nearby communities. We'd meet monthly as a group, and I'd meet with each of them individually between those gatherings. I wasn't their boss or their supervisor. I was simply a fellow traveler who'd walked the road ahead of them and could help them navigate the difficult terrain. Word spread. Within a year, I was mentoring 8 pastors and had started a small group for ministry couples, hosted in our home. Martha and I would cook dinner, and we'd create a safe space where these couples could talk honestly about the unique pressures of ministry life, the fishbowl existence, the unrealistic expectations, the toll on their marriages and families. One evening, after everyone had left, Martha looked at me and said, "You know what's different about this ministry compared to when you were at the church?" "What's that?" I asked. "You're giving from your overflow now, not from your reserves," she said. You're not exhausted all the time. You're present with them and with me. She was right again. The pace was sustainable. The boundaries were healthier. I wasn't trying to be all things to all people anymore. I was focused on a specific calling to a specific group of people, using the specific gifts and experiences God had given me. And here's what surprised me most. This new ministry brought me more satisfaction than the last decade of my formal pastoral role. I was having deeper conversations, seeing more transformation, building more authentic relationships. Without the administrative burden of running a church, I could focus entirely on the aspects of ministry I was most gifted for. About 2 years into this new chapter, I received an email that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a church member I'd never met, from a congregation I'd never visited, in a town 3 hours away. "Pastor Jack," it began. "You don't know me, but my pastor is part of your mentoring group. I'm writing to thank you because our church has been transformed over the past year. Our pastor came back from his first retreat with you with a renewed vision and energy we hadn't seen in years. Whatever you're pouring into him is spilling over onto all of us." I sat at my computer, tears streaming down my face. This was the ripple effect in action. By investing deeply in one leader, I was indirectly touching hundreds of lives. And this was happening with each pastor in the group. I printed that email and pinned it to my office bulletin board as a reminder of an important truth. Influence doesn't always require a platform. Sometimes the most significant impact happens in the quiet conversations, the private encouragements, the behind-the-scenes guidance that no one else ever sees. This realization freed me from something I hadn't even recognized was binding me, the need for public recognition and affirmation. For decades, I'd received immediate feedback on my ministry through Sunday handshakes, attendance numbers, and direct responses to sermons. Now, much of my impact was invisible to me, happening in congregations I'd never visit and lives I'd never know. And surprisingly, that was okay. More than okay, it was liberating. I was learning to find satisfaction in the work itself, rather than the recognition it brought. I was serving for the pure joy of serving, not for the affirmation it might generate. As this new ministry continued to grow and evolve, I began to notice unexpected blessings emerging from this season. Gifts I never would have received had I continued in my former role. First, I rediscovered the joy of being a student again. Without the pressure to be the expert with all the answers, I could ask questions, explore new ideas, and even change my mind on theological issues I'd once been dogmatic about. I started reading widely, not just to prepare for sermons, but to satisfy my own curiosity and hunger for growth. Second, Martha and I found a new dimension to our marriage. For the first time in 4 decades, we were truly partners in ministry, not just a pastor and a pastor's wife. She brought her own gifts, insights, and experiences to our work with ministry couples. We were serving side by side, rather than her supporting me from the shadows. Third, I developed friendships that weren't complicated by pastoral authority. When you're a church's pastor, there's always a power dynamic at play in relationships, no matter how much you try to minimize it. Now I could simply be a friend, a peer, a fellow believer without the added layer of being the pastor. And finally, I found freedom from the tyranny of comparison. Throughout my ministry career, there was always a subtle temptation to measure my success against other churches and pastors. Attendance numbers, building projects, baptisms, budgets. Now, the metrics of success were entirely different and much more meaningful. Was I being faithful to my calling? Was I serving from a place of fullness rather than emptiness? Was I growing in my own relationship with God, even as I helped others grow in theirs? These unexpected blessings didn't erase the challenges of transition. There were still difficult days, moments of doubt, seasons of questioning. But they provided a richness to this chapter that I never anticipated when I reluctantly turned in my office keys and cleaned out my desk. Looking back on this winding path from loss to rediscovery, I've tried to distill what I've learned into some insights that might help others. Whether you're facing retirement, have already retired, or are simply going through any major life transition that's left you questioning your purpose. First, expect the grieving process. Any significant change involves loss, and loss requires grief. I needed to acknowledge and honor what I was leaving behind before I could fully embrace what was ahead. For months, I tried to skip this step, to push down the sadness and disorientation. That only prolonged the process. Second, your identity is both more stable and more fluid than you realize. The core of who you are, your character, your values, your deepest convictions, those don't change when your circumstances do. But how those elements express themselves can and should evolve throughout your life. The question isn't, who am I now that I'm not what I was? But rather, how does who I've always been take shape in this new chapter? Third, purpose often emerges from the intersection of your experience, your passions, and the needs around you. When I looked at what I'd learned through decades of ministry, what still energized me despite my age, and the specific challenges facing today's church leaders, my new direction became clear. This formula can work in any context, not just ministry. Fourth, sometimes the most meaningful work happens in the smallest circles. Our culture celebrates big platforms, wide influence, and massive impact. But I've found that depth often matters more than breadth. Investing deeply in a few has proven more satisfying and potentially more transformative than influencing many at a surface level. Fifth, sustainability is essential for long-term impact. In my formal ministry years, I often operated at an unsustainable pace, driven by urgency and the never-ending needs around me. Now, I've learned to pace myself, to build margin into my life, to say no to good opportunities so I can say yes to the best ones. This isn't selfish. It's stewardship of the limited energy and time I have. And finally, perhaps the most important lesson, God's not finished with any of us until our final breath. There are no emeritus believers, no retired disciples. The specific expression of our calling may change with seasons of life, but the calling itself remains. As long as we have breath, we have purpose. As my new ministry has grown, I've become increasingly aware that I'm not alone in this experience. Millions of people reach retirement each year and find themselves asking the same questions I wrestled with. Who am I now? What's my purpose? Does my life still have meaning? This awareness has expanded my sense of calling once again. Beyond mentoring current church leaders, I've begun gathering with other retired ministers and professionals to create spaces where we can collectively reimagine this season of life. We meet monthly at a local coffee shop, former pastors, retired teachers, a physician who closed his practice after 45 years, a business executive who sold her company. Despite our diverse backgrounds, we share a common desire to use our accumulated wisdom, experience, and newfound freedom in meaningful ways. From these gatherings, beautiful initiatives have emerged. The retired physician now volunteers at a free clinic 2 days a week. The business executive mentors women starting small businesses. A former school principal tutors struggling readers at an elementary school. Each person has found a unique way to continue their life's work in a new form. What's striking to me is how much joy fills our conversations. These aren't people, grimly fulfilling obligations out of duty. They're men and women who have discovered, or rediscovered, their purpose, and are pursuing it with enthusiasm and gratitude. This has shown me something profound. Retirement isn't the end of purpose. It's an opportunity to pursue purpose with greater focus, freedom, and authenticity than ever before. Without the constraints of earning a living or climbing a career ladder, we're free to align our daily activities more directly with our deepest values and convictions. That's a message our culture desperately needs to hear. The narrative that retirement means withdrawal, that aging means irrelevance. These are lies that rob both individuals and communities of immense value and potential. So here I am, 5 years into what I once feared would be a purposeless retirement, more engaged, more fulfilled, and arguably more impactful than ever before. The path wasn't straight or easy. There were dark valleys of doubt, confusion, and loss of identity. There were moments I wondered if my useful days were behind me. But through that wilderness journey, I found a clearing, a new understanding of purpose that transcends title, position, or paycheck. I discovered that what I had to offer wasn't primarily my energy or my abilities, but my experience, my perspective, and the wisdom that can only come through years of both success and failure. If you're listening to this and finding yourself in a similar transition, whether through retirement, career change, empty nest, or any major life shift, I want to encourage you. This isn't the end of your story. It's simply the beginning of a new chapter. And it might just be the most meaningful one. Yet, the questions that tormented me those first months of retirement, who am I now? What's my purpose? They haven't disappeared entirely. I still revisit them from time to time. But they no longer fill me with dread. Instead, they invite me into continued growth and discovery. I've come to believe that purpose isn't something we find once and for all. It's something we discern and develop throughout our lives, something that evolves as we do. And that process never ends. As long as we're willing to keep asking the questions and listening for the answers. If this message resonates with you, I'd love to hear your story. How are you navigating your own transitions? What purpose have you discovered in this season of life? Or what questions are you wrestling with as you search for that purpose? You can share your thoughts in the comments below, or reach out through the contact information in the description. And if you found value in this conversation, please consider sharing it with someone else who might be walking a similar path. Remember, your greatest contribution may still be ahead of you. Your experience matters. Your wisdom is needed. And your purpose, it's still unfolding. Thank you for listening. This is Pastor Jack, signing off, not from retirement, but from the most purposeful chapter of my life so far.